Welcome to yet another episode of the Family Pictures Podcast. I'm here with my beloved co-host,
Michael Branson Smith. Welcome, Jim Groom.
With the high pitch.
Welcome, Jim. When it's time to change, you gotta read your
So, thank
Never
you,
expecting
Michael.
a Brady Bunch reference there, right?
That's what that's from.
Yeah,
I'm too into the movies right now.
Yeah.
I can't think about TV. But I'm here to talk with you today about our next kind of thematic group of movies that we'll be talking about. So for any of you who are just tuning in for the first time, we've been doing a series of themes. We've done everything from like Cameron Crowe versus John Hughes, 80s films. We've looked at 70s horror films. We've looked at Families on the Run more recently. And I know I'm forgetting one in there somewhere.
Indie families.
Indie families.
From the independent films of like the 90s, basically.
So this would be our fifth kind of conglomeration of films. And we usually do 5 or 6 films in a topic. And at this point, we've kind of turned to what will be kind of us going as far back as we've gone in this podcast to the mid-50s to start talking about frontier families, in particular, start talking about Westerns. And that's pretty kind of American of us, if you will, because it's a story about not only the idea of family and pioneering, but also some of the ideas of, race, violence, questions of chosen versus blood families, settlers versus natives, patriarchs, the whole frontier father. And there's so many kind of rich themes and ideas that we can explore. So we're picking a whole new group of films. I won't let you know what those films are yet. Maybe we will at some point make some announcements and do this more regularly. But
it's not like we're good at social media, Jim, and like putting ourselves out there. This is still us limping along, getting better and better, but hoping more and more will listen eventually.
But we're still figuring it out in terms of just
I love that. I do.
How we do it, but also the idea of like the cultural American myth surrounding the West and living in Italy. It's so interesting to see just how pervasive that myth remains in terms of when people reflect on the US and its long history or short history if you're a European and what that has meant. So it's kind of it's a rich moment where we're not only dealing with families, but how families so quickly become about the nation, about the state, and about how Western over time changes our relationship to those ideas and to that mythos. So this is pretty exciting for me. I mean, Michael, you let me introduce this one because I have like literarily, how would you say?
Literary chops.
Chops or roots.
Yes, I'm just a man who thought he was going to spend his life making movies, but instead has somehow, put that into talking about film, making content still. Like I can't help myself. I still make stuff. This is the thing that I think, just to give a brief bit of background, this is how Jim and I really met, is through me making crap and shoving it in Jim's face, back when we were part of this open digital storytelling class. And I think you first met me through me presenting an old friend doing kaiju big battle. And I had my students showcasing monster wrestling and then entering a wonderful community of people that just thought anybody could make art, anybody could tell stories. And it continues to this day. I have many homages to Jim Groom out there of his persona, which is an odd thing that I've done. But despite all that, this is our kind of a culmination of, I think, our relationship so far, which has been so great. And we're going to start the frontier family, the frontier father of the ultimate archetype in the film The Searchers, which is John Ford's 1956 masterpiece, which in a funny way, I think it's a masterpiece of its time. And I think that's going to be an important way to think about this movie. I don't know if people now would see it as a masterpiece, but the people that grew up in the new Hollywood era, the Scorseses, the George Lucases, the who else? The Spielbergs, this was their, kind of benchmark of greatness in a lot of ways. And it's hard because if you watch it now, it's this film that if you, like myself, really struggle to watch John Wayne perform masculinity at its height of masculine of the greatest generation and how what a man's man was, and the boomer generation that followed that deconstructed it very successfully for decades in those films, but at the same time they were honoring his archetype in a weird way, like, the I think some of the writing that I read and put in my notes is how we have like Travis Bickle is Ethan, right? That,
Yeah,
and Spielberg visually, I think, is probably most inspired by this film, like the doorways that we see Ethan
totally.
named in Family, and from Close Encounters when the aliens are greeted, or in Saving Private Ryan when the mother receives the news of her three dead sons. And even George Lucas in Star Wars, of all things, and the Tuscan Raid is the
Yeah,
returning to finding the burned down family and
that must be home. And then
and so it's a film that I never would have approached is because I actually love westerns, but the '50s westerns, I love the '50s western shows like Gunsmoke and stuff like that because they're just like these performances, and they're often funny and oh gosh, and Hoss, not what's the family, the Cartwrights, what was that show? And those characters are kind of more gentle, right? And they're more romance novels, and they're more fake performance of bravado. There's no real violence. They're just punching fights in saloons, and everybody's laughing at the end of the episode for the most part. Where this is really grappling with a character who's the beginnings of in the role of Ethan, um, who's a true anti-hero, our first kind of anti-hero, an archetype that is really not someone that we should like in a lot of ways, and which is good because I don't like John Wayne generally speaking. And there's this one great quote that I found where Jean-Luc Godard, and this is the origins of the French New Wave, who celebrated this film. This was like John Ford was one of their heroes, he and
yeah,
Howard Hawks. And Jean-Luc Godard, who hated John Wayne's politics because he was a staunch Republican, and they're super liberal European French filmmakers. He and Truffaut, and but he adored this performance for what he created, and he's like, "God damn it, you, for making me like you all over again."
I'll tell you. I mean, interesting. My kind of introduction to this film, like many, comes in the early '90s. I'm at UCLA. I wasn't a big Western fan at all. During my childhood, I kind of resisted a lot of the Westerns. It was all on TV, but was not my thing. But I was in a class on film genres at UCLA, and this came up as one of the films they were showing. And John Wayne, I had every kind of like John Wayne, like all I
Yeah.
knew from John Wayne was the quote in Repo Man, right? Like where they make fun of John Wayne, like he watched his friends have sex through two-way mirrors. Like I didn't have any respect for John Wayne, like most good punks. I see this film though at UCLA, and I am like at the same time reading in my literature classes, like, A Light in August by Faulkner. And it was so interesting to me because film, which for me was still kind of, I wasn't understanding it. Like there was literature and then there was film, kind of like, most people like that's popular culture. This is art.
Yeah.
But when you see searchers and you're reading something like William Faulkner, who is dealing with the whole idea of an octoroon, who's kind of dealing with his race in the South and how to navigate that in this beautiful kind of narrative turn. And then you see, Ethan and Martin struggling over Martin's kind of notions of being 1/8 Cherokee, and then obviously Debbie, who gets kind of taken into the Comanche and is made wife. Like all of those racial questions of blood and kind of being pure and the notion of
Yeah.
what it means to be. And I'm like, wow. John Ford, William Faulkner, like these are two great artists working on many ways the same topic around the same time. I mean, John Ford's been making films since the 20s. So like it was one of those moments in film where I didn't see it, oh, it's just popular culture reflecting the culture, which this still does. But this is one of those first films where I was like, oh, wait, this is art in every sense of the word, in every scene, in every character, the way it goes from comedy to serious kind of brooding, tragedy. This is a great film. Like this is a masterpiece of the film. And that was kind of telling for me. Like this is one of the films that was that entree point into like, wow, film as art, and John Ford in the Western as like the genre to contend with in film. So it's kind of like a turning point in my whole understanding of film. For me, it's very important. The other thing that they did in this class is that I got introduced to a book that I then went and looked for. It's called Six Guns in Society. It was a 1975 book written by the Berkeley professor Will Wright. And it's interesting. If you're into structuralism or anything, it's like a structuralism breakdown of the Western to talk about every different category, every different notion of kind of hero. And it does it in a very Levi Strauss structuralist way. And I think he was like a sociologist. But it was also one of those first real kind of considerations of the Western, not just as garbage that people watch for entertainment, but as a real kind of reflection of the society at any given point of time that Western is on. So like, how are the 60s Westerns different from the 50s
Oh
Westerns,
yeah.
different from the 40s Westerns? And it was a really fascinating look at how what we did kind of with the 70s horror film, how those films of those eras reflect, the preoccupations, the anxieties, the aspirations of a generation. And I think in this regard, The Searchers is kind of in between the greatest generation and the boomers. And
Yeah.
so it has this really interesting moment where John Wayne is kind of shifting away from his kind of always valiant hero to a brooding, dark, kind of anti-hero, which
Oh yeah.
he plays only one other time in Red River. So it's an interesting moment for film, I think, for the Western, but also for what we're going to talk about, because this is John Wayne literally as the anti-hero dad.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's cool is like with this series, we're going to, instead of where 70s horror, we were stuck in a single period. I think we're going to do, as you're suggesting, look at Westerns and frontier families across eras. And we're going to get into the 2000s, and we're going to bridge through the 70s with some, I think, wonderful movies. But as we are in the 50s, one of the things that I think is so interesting is that you have John Ford talking about race, talking about the atrocities of the frontierism of the 1800s in a 50s way, which is very constrained. We were talking about this right before the movie, and it made me think of like The Day the Earth Stood Still, and like it was a piece of science fiction that was a way of talking about McCarthyism. It was the only way you could get away with talking about these issues that you want to talk about, because the constraints of the 50s only allowed you to put so much culture, so much representation of reality out into the culture, And this film with, John Wade's use of, crass language like half-breed and blanket head, that was really, really pushing it. The reviews at the time talked about that as like really, rough language for an audience to be consuming. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see it that way. And so I guess we can kind of start to get into, we can talk a teeny, this is based on a novel from 1954 by Alan LeMay. And it's inspired by, he did a lot of research into kind of kidnapped and abducted, mostly women, into Native American tribes. And he interviewed, I think, he didn't interview. He studied like 64 captives from Texas. And in particular, he studied this man named Britt Johnson, who's kind of lost to history, who seems really interesting, who was a former slave who lived in Texas. and his wife and 2 children are abducted, and he basically searches for them until he's able to finally ransom from them for 7 ponies. But then he continues to do this, and what's wonderful is this man becomes kind of a hero of the West, in a very white Texas that's very racist still, and he eventually is killed. And this is an era when it's very hard to know history from, like, performance art practically, of people celebrating his, like, oh, he rescued 60 other people. We don't know for sure. But we know he was killed by Kiowa Raiders, and he was lionized in newspapers in Texas at the time, right?
Yeah.
Which is something you would never imagine, like an incredible piece of forgotten history,
Yeah.
ultimately.
And like they're like his fearlessness knew no bounds. Like he would
Yeah,
going to these places and trade really like ponies and stuff to
right,
get these people back. And
right.
yeah,
I
interesting
mean,
story.
and my imagining is immediately, it's like, man, imagine if the Searchers, John Wayne's character, was like Sidney Poitier instead. Like, imagine
Yeah.
that. That would have been insane.
Yeah.
There's no way that would have ever happened, but man, that would have been incredible.
But to your point, a decade later, that does start to happen, right? Like
Exactly.
they do start to push a bit on those
Yeah.
bounds. But I do think you have to understand the film within its moment, right?
Yeah.
And for the moment, even having John Wayne play this very aggro, racist, you
Yeah.
know, unlikable character,
Yeah.
really broken, if you will,
Yeah.
whether it's from the war or from whatever,
Hmm.
was already kind of pushing the limits of what people would expect from a character like John Wayne would play. And I think even that makes it interesting. But the other part of this film that makes it interesting is just the absolute stunning background and scenery,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like for me, I don't know if you've ever read the book by Cormac McCarthy called Blood Meridian.
No, but
So
yeah.
Blood Meridian is basically a 1985 Western that is a novel that it's unfilmable. They tried to, but so violent. It's so violent that it's unfilmable. Like you couldn't. But it basically takes this story with the Texas Rangers, doing a search, but not in the same way for the same reasons, and it places them in this environment, but with blood and guts and horror like you couldn't imagine.
Yeah.
And the figure that comes up there is this figure called Judge Reinhold. And no, not Judge Reinhold, Judge. But then I don't know his last name. Judge Reinhold would be the actor, but it's basically the judge. And he's this kind of like devil-like figure who
Mm.
kind of controls everyone around him. And it was like a source of darkness. And in some ways, I often wonder, did Cormac McCarthy like channel a little bit of John Wayne from the Searchers to kind of get to this figure? Because John Wayne isn't as horrible as the judge, but it just takes everything in the Searchers and brings it to a level of atrocity that you just couldn't imagine. And supposedly it's a brilliantly and like tediously researched book, The
Yeah.
Blood Meridian. And I think of it as a companion piece to the Searchers, just in a completely different reimagining of how horrific the Texas Rangers were to everyone around them. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's an aside from me, but I
Yeah.
see that background. When I see the background of this film, that's the background I brought to reading Blood Meridian, right? That was the world, if
Wow.
you will, right?
Yeah.
Just like Lucas brought that world to Star Wars.
Right, right. Yeah, and I mean, as one does when you're doing these kinds of research, you go into rabbit holes. And I was like reading all about Kit Carson, because his name comes up in the really badly. One of the things in the background of this film is we realized that John Ford had documentary filmmakers shoot a movie about the making of the movie, which was one of the first
Yeah.
of its kind. And it's terrible because they don't know what the hell they're doing with this kind of genre yet. And it's very performative and not authentic at all. But that's too bad. But regardless of that, what's crazy is that we have, wait, now I'm lost. We have the, so they talk, the speaker in this thing talks about Kit Carson. And so I'm like, Kit Carson, and like, this has got to be bullshit what they're saying about Kit Carson. And I think Kit Carson is probably more of this judge, because this is a person who, witnessed and participated in pure massacres, and calls it up in his autobiography like a perfect butchering, a
Yeah.
butchering, and these are bad people that are truly traumatized. Like before PTSD existed, this is what, these people went through. And so that's a perfect place to start, I think, and to
Yeah.
finally kind of enter into this film, because we are presented with kind of a 50s idyllic family. You know what I mean? Because
Totally.
the film opens with kind of the Edwards household, and we're seeing Martha looking off into the distance as Ethan is arriving after, the many wars he's been part of. He's a former Confederate soldier, but then he went on to fight in this, not maybe it's the Spanish American
It's the
War.
Franco-Mexican War,
Okay, yeah.
where Napoleon III tried to put in a emperor, Maximilian, who's here from like Trieste in Italy, and they
Oh,
had to try to do this where France was trying to regain Mexico, and then Juarez and that group recamped. America sent reinforcements to Juarez, and then they got rid of Napoleon. Then, but that was a whole war that John Wayne goes down in this character. Ethan goes
yeah,
down and fights in, which was a
right.
brutal war.
Post Confederacy, and
Post,
we later hear him describe he has never given up his vow to the Confederate
no,
States of America. And so
and
that is like a declaration of unabashed racism right
oh,
then and there.
absolutely from the beginning. And
Yeah.
on top of that, and we'll talk about that opening shot. But on top of that, his brother is like, "How long you here for, Ethan? Whatever." And he's like, "Don't you question me about whether
Yeah.
I could pay my own way." And he brings out a fortune of gold
Yeah.
that he won't explain to anyone how he
No,
got.
and it's clearly most like, and this is part of the subtext that is constantly, or the hidden text. It's not a subtext; it's a hidden text. There's all these hiding of realities, and this is
Yeah,
like it's got to be plunder. This is money
yeah,
stolen from murder,
yeah,
and
exactly.
there's all sorts of violence that is hidden because that's what the wars of the 50s allowed. You couldn't, if it was Tarantino, there would be a flashback to him like basically hatcheting someone's head and taking the gold from them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it'd be like in Dead Man when the guy steps on the guy's head and his head explodes. It would be like that. But
Yeah.
I mean, back to that opening scene that you talked about so well. The first thing I thought is basically you're following Martha as she's going to the doorway.
Uh-huh.
And most of those throughout the film, there's these framed shot doorways,
Mm. Yeah.
which are just gorgeous because it blacks out everything but that one piece of the Western frontier.
Right.
She walks out and it kind of camera follows her and looks to the left, and you see in space, John Wayne coming at. And it
Mhm.
reminded me almost of the shot of Roy Scheider in Jaws or something, just the way in which space moves. And it's obviously not the same kind of dolly shot or dolly zoom, but like the way in which they're using space to kind of emphasize just how wide and
Yeah.
how barren this world is from the beginning is just magical.
Yeah, no, and that's like the classic like myth of the American landscape, right? The setting is the story of where myths were created. The story
Yeah,
of American frontier and conquest can be nowhere else but, the Monument Valley, right? Where there are the beautiful buttes, even though like you can't imagine anybody settling in that space. There's no grass or water anywhere.
right.
So, who the hell is going to raise cattle in that space? That would be awful. Um, and so, but as they enter, it's like you're trying to walk into an episode of Leave It to Beaver, and the tables being made with beautiful china and flatware. There's a
That's right.
hearth with the photos, or family ornaments. It's a perfect family. We have two daughters and a boy. In the boys we have Ben and Debbie and what is it, no, Sarah. Is it Sarah? That I can't remember. I have them all here together. It's
It's Debbie, Martha, Aaron,
oh, Martha.
Mel,
Oh no, Martha's the mother. Oh shoot,
mother.
yeah.
You
So
put Debbie twice. I forget what the first
well,
one's name.
Debbie. Yeah, yeah, I think it's Sarah.
Okay, we'll say
Yeah,
Sarah.
yeah.
Yeah, it is Sarah.
Oh, good job, me. And so, Sarah's much older than she's the oldest. And so she's starting to flirt. She's starting to have a relationship with one of the neighboring family's son, Brad Jorgensen. And you get this like classic, Ben, who's the youngest, or not the youngest, he's the middle child, but he's younger. He's making fun of her, like, oh, they're making kissy faces. And it's like right out of Beaver making fun of like
Totally.
Wally, and so
Yeah.
this is that kind of weird disjunction here. So it's like, what if an asshole drunk, uncle showed up to like leave it to Beaver's house? Cause that's what Ethan is. Cause he's like a total, he is so disrespectful of this household from the jump in a lot of ways, with the exception of the way he stares at Martha, which,
It's interesting. Yeah, that whole thing. And I'll tell you, there is a precedent for this.
yeah.
Shadow of a Doubt, that noir by Hitchcock, has
Okay.
Joseph Cotton play this really questionable uncle who comes into a like very happy family because his sister like says, "Oh, Uncle whatever's coming back,"
Uh-huh.
and he's all sorts of crazy and creepy.
Yeah.
And so it's actually like I can see Shadow of Doubt and Searchers as a nice double feature about creepy uncles.
Yeah, even though his being an uncle is such a small role ultimately, but yeah, there is something clearly, and it's really interesting because there's, as critics and writers can't help they speculate, like the way that they stare at one, he stares at her, she stares at him. He has this thing where he wants to make out with her, but always kisses her on the forehead, which is infantilizing at the same time, which is so weird. And they're like, dude, this Debbie, the youngest, is probably his daughter, is, what they basically
I
suggest.
didn't
It's
even
like,
think of that. That's
yeah,
right.
it's like, there was an affair going on at some point, possibly. And that creates this other context to when the later abduction happens. So, but this household is this ideal, and, it's in contrast to, what's going to be the destruction of this family that sets off the entire story. Because, Ethan is this man is like, I can pay my way. And we're like, where's this money coming from? And then
Exactly.
immediately it's the next morning, and we have the Texas Rangers show up with Reverend Captain Clayton, who's another masculine. Oh, wait, no, we are forgetting one thing before we move on, is Martin shows up, so he shows up late to dinner,
Yeah.
and we're introduced to Martin, who's kind of the adopted, child of this family.
Who we find out that Ethan discovered,
Uh-huh.
and a burning raid by Native Americans. And so he was kind of saved, but
Literally.
he's 1/8, Cherokee. So
And
Ethan obviously has a very weird relationship to
no,
him.
he dismisses him. He calls him a
Oh.
half-breed, immediately, and he looks at him sideways when he walks in, like, "What are you doing in this household? You don't belong here."
Absolutely.
Where
Yeah.
clearly the Edwards have adopted him, and they
Yeah.
see him as family. He calls, you know, you know, Martha and Aaron, like, basically aunt and uncle. And it's accepted that, basically that Ben and Sarah and Debbie are his siblings of
That's right.
as much.
And really, in some ways, that Ethan not really being his uncle, Ethan is kind of his dad
Yeah,
or a father-like figure, right?
very much
Saves his
so.
life, brings him in, and that's a completely trippy relationship that will be discovered or explored throughout the film. But the other thing about Martha and Ethan that I think is interesting is,
Yeah.
as Martha was coming in and they were having that glance,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And then he kisses her on the forehead, like you said. But there's always, and she's like looking at his clothes and holding his clothes, and
Uh-huh.
there's all that weirdness. I thought they were brother and sister, and Aaron was the brother-in-law.
Oh, initially.
And
Yeah,
then
I can
he
see that,
starts
yeah.
saying to his brother, Aaron, like they start talking and like fighting like brothers. And I'm like, oh, wait. So something is truly weird with Ethan
Yeah.
and Martha.
I guess that's how it is in their family.
You only have so many people out there when you're, living in Monument Valley. So some things are going to get weird, right?
Poor Aaron, he got cuckolded and never even known. But he's dead, so whatever. And so so Martin is like very much treated as an outsider, and the outsider nature of what is kin? Is it blood versus is it tribe? As we're going to future discuss, becomes really important, because right now in this moment, from Ethan's perspective, Martin is an outsider. He is not blood, so therefore is not family. And he basically is pushed out the door early, and not allowed to stay over. And you imagine his character, and we don't know where he lives, and but you imagine he probably, for the most part, lives there. And now maybe he's like going out to the barn for the night because Ethan's here and he's not allowed to stay, and that maybe that's what's going on. It's not very clear what's happening to poor Martin in this context. And so we jump forward really quickly, and the kind of MacGuffin of the film is Clayton and his Texas Rangers showing up. The Jorgensen's cattle's been stolen, and we got to put together a posse. And Clayton is just like John Wayne's counterpart. Like they're like classic, like men are men, and we're telling everybody what to do. And he's barking at Martha, get me coffee, and blah blah blah. And everybody's like hustling around him, doing all this stuff to fawn and dote on the man of the house of this moment. And then Ethan shows up and he's like, oh, wait, another man's man. I gotta square off with this guy, you know?
Well, Ward Bond, who plays the Reverend,
Yeah.
right, is just amazing.
Yeah.
Like, and he is a great counterpart to your point with John Wayne, because that's also, there's a lot of tension there.
Yeah.
Because, Ward Bond is a for all intents and purposes, the moral figure. He's a reverend. He's a Texas Ranger. He's both law and order and piety. Like,
Yeah.
he's a very interesting figure. And then immediately Ethan comes in, and beyond the stolen gold, the wars, the merchant violence, here he is facing off against not giving his vow to the Texas Rangers,
Right.
to your point earlier,
Yeah.
because he's already given one vow, and one vow he can never break, and that's the vow to the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, wait.
Wow, you're that kind of guy. We were already kind of suspicious of your intentions here with, how do you even fit in the Edwards family? But
I mean, and Ford is laying it on here. So it's not even like if you're in an audience in the 50s, like, you're probably making these connections. They always talk about what happened. Did you lose your Johnny Reb coat? Like, there's all these references to him being part of the losing legacy of the South.
Yeah. Yeah. And so they immediately make a posse and they head out, to try to, track down. And what's interesting here as well is you basically have Ethan, pushing Aaron down. It's like, no, you're a domestic dad. You are not a frontiersman dad. Right. And you stay home, honey. And that's what he's saying to his brother. Right. It's like, you have no place. And he accepts this. And this is a very interesting. One of the things that I think is going to be interesting is what's acceptable masculinity in the front on the frontier, and Aaron's too gentle to be a protector, and Ethan's too broken to stay in a homestead. And so neither is going to be successful in this world. But at the same time, it's never answered, like what's appropriate and acceptable masculinity. And that's something that isn't surprising that John Ford isn't going to try to answer, because he's a man's man of his era ultimately as well.
Sure. Well, it's interesting too. There's a couple of things that I was thinking about while watching this, just based on other things I've done. One of the things is the Comanche are kind of also exploiting this masculinity, aren't they? Because they're taking these cows, bringing them out, knowing that the men are all going to get together, range up, and go after them, and then they're going to be able to raid their homesteads. Right. And so, like, they're smart and they're exploiting this kind of white masculinity, if you will. And they do it well, right? They're not to be fucked with, right? No. And so I like that, John Ford always gives them their kind of due. He doesn't treat them, he doesn't look down at them in the same way that maybe Ethan does, at least on film, which I think is interesting.
No, and it's rare too, because they are both murderous stereotypes, murderous, like, Native American Indians, like the Redskins. As no one uses that phrase, but you wouldn't have been surprised if they had. But at the same time, he is humanizing them as intelligent. They have their own traumas that they're dealing with, which we're going to find out about later. Exactly. And there's a rationale for this basic plundering and endless cycle of violence between frontier family and, Native American family.
Yeah. And, Their relationship is always tense and always without trust, as you imagine it really was, right? The
Mhm.
other piece here that I think is interesting is Ford and Wayne's relationship post World War II was really tense and was really problematic. The reason for that is John Ford, like many other of the kind of actors and sports stars and whatever of the 40s, all went to war. They
Mm.
left their careers and they put the effort towards war. John Wayne was one of the most notable and biggest actors of the era who didn't.
Right.
And John Ford never respected him for that. And they actually had deep problems
Mm.
as a result of that. Even though John Ford was a star, well, John Wayne was a star, and John Ford still worked with him, there was always that question about why didn't John Wayne join the force? Why didn't he go to war? Like, what was up with that? And I think you see a lot of that in John Wayne's character and that kind of like resentment and sense of like, mercenary in Ethan. And
Mm.
I kind of read back into that, like, Ford is kind of exploring some of John Wayne's, darker sides or failings. And I think part of that if you're in the context, is Wayne didn't go to war. I
Yeah.
mean, how many stars or sports stars can you think of in the modern era that quit their job to go post 9/11 to fight the war on terror? Can you
Till
name any?
Tillman, he's dead.
Only Pat
Yeah.
Tillman is the
Yeah.
only one I can think of.
Yeah.
And he died under friendly fire, which is
Yeah.
tragic. And
Yeah.
people in New York still like, Pat Tillman, American patriot. But
Yeah.
like in America, in the 40s, it was like, uh, what's Joe DiMaggio,
Oh, yeah.
right? Jimmy
Elvis
Stewart,
Presley.
everybody,
Yeah.
right? Like everybody went to war.
Mhm.
But that's not the era. And it kind of shows
No,
for
I
me
mean, think
a
about it. It's like
generational difference.
Captain America as a character, like one of the most iconic characters of our day, and even now, is a man who was not able to join the war effort because he's too small, but again and again and again and again tries to figure out and manipulate his
Yeah.
way onto, the battlefield. And he eventually becomes a Superman, but whatever, not Superman, but
But
super.
how far have we come from that
Yeah.
moment of the greatest generation, which I think is important for
Yeah.
talking about generational kind of, trauma and generational kind of identity in this film.
Yeah, I mean, and that comes with it is like the iconography of heroes and villains. Like the villain is very clear in that era versus in the heroes, we ourselves are very clearly the rescuers. And the idea of rescuing versus plundering and vengeance is, I think, we're gonna be coming towards, because what happens is as they discover they've been outwitted, they return to the because they're either like, well, it's either they're going after either the Jorgensens or the Edwards household, and so the Jorgensens take off Brad and his father, go back to their household, and same thing, we have Martin take off, leaving too soon because the horse isn't going to make it, the next morning he's passed by Ethan on his horse, and he's got just his saddle. This horse must have been dead, must be dead because he ran it too hard. And this is this thing that exists throughout the film where Martin is always kind of the lesser of the two. Like he's the follower. And I think what's great is Chief Scar summarizes that in like 2 lines, which is so wonderful.
The
And this
one
is,
who follows.
yeah, in One Who Follows versus Big Shoulders. And which is very true. I mean,
It's great. Yeah.
John Wayne was an imposing human being, and that's part of like masculinity of that era.
And he's dressed like a hipster,
Yeah.
right? I mean, the jeans rolled
Yeah.
up, that
Yeah.
red shirt. He looks fucking awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is the beginning of him, kind of protecting and limiting the violence that the rest of the boys or others have to endure. And he sees this as his burden. And that's the archetype of that era, is like, I will take on the burden of the violence that has happened to family and others, and try to protect what remains of family, even though myself, I'm never going to be able to participate this. And this is immediately seen. And this is classic 50s. We don't see the violence, but we know what must have happened. Like,
Sadly.
because the son, Aaron, Ben, and Martha are dead, and we eventually learn that Martha's actually been scalped, and
Flayed,
yes,
Oh.
and you know Martin wants to see them, and this is his family. It's not really Ethan's family because Ethan doesn't have the ability to stay connected to family. Honestly, I think is something we're going to learn more and more because he's like kind of a ghostly figure that is just haunting what remains of his identity of how to seek revenge and what he believes must be done to keep the faith of what an idea family is supposed to be, and that's going to get complicated as he is trying to rescue Debbie, because
Totally.
we learn also. But first, he won't let Martin see, and he literally knocks him out as he tries to enter the hut where they were, and they quickly learn that both Sarah and Debbie have been abducted.
Yeah. And I mean, that moment too that you're talking about, like the trauma that Ethan's doing, and Ethan's coming off two wars, right? He's coming off Civil War and the Franco-Mexican War, a second Franco-Mexican War, I think it's called. But anyway, two of the most, I can't speak of the Franco-Mexican War, but certainly the Civil War was a horrific war in
Yeah.
what that did, and worst war in American history, right? In terms of what it did to the American fabric and how many soldiers died that were all that. But then you also have the great generation coming off World War II, in many ways equally horrific, what they
Yeah.
were fighting for, what they left in. And that breeds a whole new genre of film, the noir, right? Where you deal with these kind of post war lost souls, everything you were saying about Ethan. And I think it's interesting because Ford almost takes these elements of the post-war noir and brings them into the Western genre in these moments when
Mm.
he's basically talking about these horrific moments, and we'll hear another one later on. You get a sense of like this post-war figure who's still trying to work through all the violence and horror he's lived and even maybe dealt out to others.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's funny is like the one thing that if this film were made, even like 10 years later, John Wayne's character would be drunk the whole time. Like he would have been drinking constantly because that's basically what men of World War II kind of did to escape like the trauma of like the violence that they've seen or participated in. It's like, just let me not think about it and escape. Like this is the one thing that they isn't in this film at all, is this what is Ethan's way of escaping his own consciousness, and he's not allowed to. That's the very archetype of the 50s, is you deal with it, son, this is who you are. And that's what
Yeah.
they say they're doing, but in reality we know that they spent the madmen of the 50s spent all of their lives just trying to not remember most of this and saying like, I don't want to talk about it. And that becomes a very specific line that's oft repeated. It's like,
Yeah,
don't make me talk about this. I'm not going to talk about it. Don't you ever ask me again. And that's
that's
very
right.
much like this typification of kids saying like, Dad, why don't you ever talk about blah, blah, blah. It's like, don't you ever make me talk about that. I'm not going to do that. These are not enlightened, emotionally aware human beings.
No. And maybe there was a reason given what they saw and what they
Yeah.
were through, right? There is also that,
Yeah, no, it's real. And that's why reading, like I said, like reading the Kit Carson like Wikipedia, and I mean, man, that guy saw some shit, and he did some shit. And
shit.
it's really, really, I can only imagine what it means to be a human being who's cast off and when you're 16-year-olds and attaching yourself to like, and we're going to get to this like real, trappers and spending years in the wilderness just surviving through violence and it's nuts. And so this is someone who's trying to protect family, and he's doing this, and now he's supposedly sending off on a rescue mission. But there's this wonderful brief scene where this is the first time we're really introduced to the other family, which is the Jorgensens, right? We have,
Yeah.
which is the beginning of a portrait of an immigrant family. And that's kind of interesting because you didn't really get in these Westerns portraits of immigrant families unless you're really kind of marginalizing them on the side. And this is this family is front and center as part of the story because Lori becomes a paramour of Martin. We learn later on in the film, and there's this really, really interesting situation where Martin is sent a letter, and a large part of the many years of their searching for Debbie, which we're going to learn happens, is through a letter. And it's kind of funny that like they do this kind of temporal thing where they're bouncing back and forth between the hearth of the Jorgensens and the events that are happening. And there's some actual comedy in there. But the Jorgensen family is introduced in this interesting way as because the families, the Edwards family has been slaughtered, and Debbie and Sarah are out there, and they're like, we have to go after them. And Ethan's like literally cuts the funeral short and says, we gotta go.
Yeah, that's right. He like walks over their graves and like, let's go.
Let's go. Yeah. We gotta go. And Mrs. and she's it's classic 50s. She's not given a first name. Mrs. Jorgensen is simply imploring Ethan, and this is really telling, to protect the boys. And she's specifically talking about her boy, Brad, and effectively Martin as well, because they're remaining sons of these families. The sons are the future generation. And she's like saying, you must protect these boys. And even though Mr. Jorgensen, I don't forget his first name, is going to be heading off and with them on the search initially. And she says, basically protect them because she knows those girls are gone in her mind. They're dead. And so they're not really going off on a rescue mission in her mind. She's clued in. This is a mission of vengeance. Yeah. And this is like, she's like, just fucking let it go, and let's live. And she is that other kind of moral center, and their family is wonderful. They're a part of so much of the comedy.
It comes later, but she has my favorite little monologue of the whole film.
You should talk about that now. It doesn't matter. Yeah.
I mean, well, basically her son, who's actually her son in real life.
And this is during the letter reading, effectively.
Yeah. And effectively her son in real life, Harry Carey Jr., and she's basically Harry Carey Sr.'s wife in real life. So that's really her son, which is interesting. So she's basically been told, as John Wayne and Martin come back, that he didn't make it, that their son, Brad, he went crazy. Brad, he went crazy when he heard what happened to Sarah, and he did a run for the Comanche, and the Comanche killed him, and he was dead. And so he comes back and tells you, but you realize once they get back that this is a year later. So they've had some time to process it. So they're not like, they're kind of taking the son's death very much in stride.
Right.
And you're kind of like strange. But then she has this whole bit about what it means to be a pioneer like this on the end. And she says, Lars, the father, says, it's this country killed my boy. Yes, by golly, I tell you. And Ethan, and then Miss Jorgensen breaks in and she says, no, Lars, it's just so happens we be Texicans. Texican is nothing but a human man way out on a limb. This year ain't next, and maybe for 100 more. But I don't think it'll be forever. Someday this country's gonna be a good place to be. Maybe it needs our bones in the ground before that time can come. Yeah. And that's like the great, gem of this whole movie. And maybe like Ford's philosophy is like, these people were out there on this limb, like forging what they thought was this new identity. And then all the mythos in some ways comes after that.
Right.
But this movie is almost just about those rare creatures that sat on the end on that moment of kind of forever. When you think about it, it's like being on Mars and kind of living. And I just love that she sees that so clearly. Like she understands her role in this new world so clearly. And it's so kind of philosophical yet practical all at once. I just love that quote.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting because that myth is built on a lot of settler violence ultimately, right? Like they're willing to accept, like, that's why we can accept our son is dead, because we're perpetrators as well. We're taking this land, we're making it ours. And we just see that as part of the, later on, as you described, the American myth of like, it's what is it? The manifest destiny, if you will, right?
It's white manifest destiny. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so we've kind of jumped ahead, but we should give a little more context. So they do go off on searching for Debbie and Sarah. And what quickly happens it's kind of there's a bunch of weird moments. They come across a grave of a Comanche that must have died in the raid, and they bury him, and then they desecrate the grave, and it's between both. And at first, it's like one of the Texas Rangers that are part of Clayton's posse, and then Ethan takes it a step further, and he starts firing his weapon at this dead native Comanche in the grave, and it's kind of unhinged from the start, their pursuit, and it's seemingly going nowhere, and they get themselves caught between basically flanking Comanche.
Yeah, what a great scene.
Oh, it's incredible, and like the horsemanship of this movie is nuts. Like that's
Oh,
where like talk about like 50s westerns, and what I can see people would still love about these movies is the horsemanship and the landscapes. And so they basically get pursued by the Comanche, and they barely escape, and then this leads to the de-evolution of the search. It gets reduced immediately because Clayton and Jorgensen are like, we're out, we got to go home. We're not going to be up for this. We're just going to end up dead. And Ethan's like, well, I'm still going. This is like my whole pursuit. I must find Debbie. And Brad, who's the son of the Jorgensens, who's smitten with Sarah, like that relationship has been established in the opening scene. This is someone who he hoped to marry and hopes to still marry, and even though it's never going to happen, and he must realize that. And then, of course, Martin's like, he's the follower. He's going to go wherever Ethan goes. He is got no choice, though he is understandably probably the moral center of actually, hey, motherfucker, I'm the family.
yeah.
I'm the real family. These are the people that truly raised me, and I care for them.
And Ethan continues to cut him down on that. Like, what do
Yeah.
you care about this? Who are you? You're just a
Yeah.
half breed. You're a towel head. Like,
Yeah.
we don't want to hear a blanket head. We don't want to hear from you.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
just like, what? Like, he's so rough on him.
I know. And this becomes the real beginning of the actual like extended search. You've already described how it quickly a year passes, and then more and more time passes, and they kind of, you get a sense like, as it would likely be, they're going back and forth. They would come back to the Jorgensen homestead for a period of time. And there's a lot of comedy that comes out of that initial search, as
Yeah.
we find Martin has affections for Lori, the daughter of the Jorgensens. And I actually love Lori as a character. She's
Yeah.
actually she's a, as far as like a female character in a Western goes, especially from the 50s, she's kind of in charge of who she wants to be. And she knows who Martin is, and she loves him, but she's giving it to him, literally shoves him over the bench. She also, has no fear of going into the room when he's in the
Yeah,
tub.
it's
And
awesome.
she's an incredibly standout female character in this film, which is quite surprising, I think, at that time.
Yeah, her and her mom. I
Yeah.
really like her mom too. I think that's a great character. So, a little bit more staid than Vera, but Vera Miles, who plays, whose character in the movie is what again? What's her name?
Oh, Lori.
Lori. I think she's great
She's
in the
on
fact that
Psycho too.
oh, that's right. And
Yeah.
she pushes the water on him. She's in a great episode of Twilight
Yeah.
Zone too. She pushes the water on him,
Uh-huh.
and there is that sexual tension there
Yeah,
that's being
exactly.
played in a very 50s way, but like,
Yeah.
respectfully like they
Yeah.
do. So it was, yeah, I do. I enjoy her. Plus her reading the letter is just amazing.
Yeah, and this is the house that's not idyllic, but it's actually the stable house. Like there's
Yeah.
respect in this space. Even Ethan doesn't, he has no one to like punish for not being a proper Edwards kin. It's like, this is someone else's family, so he's not going to impose himself. And so Martin is actually very comfortable in the space, and
Yeah.
he doesn't know what to do with Lori because he's smitten with her. And it's so great because like the first thing that when they come back, this is the back to where you're talking about a
Yeah.
year
The
later.
Texicans. Yeah.
Yeah, she charges at him and kisses him right away, and he's like, "Oh, I didn't know we were that," And it's probably the only charming moments. I mean, the Mose kind of buffoon, kind of
Moses.
jester
Great.
character, he's great, but it's kind of more vaudevillian than anything.
Yeah.
Um,
But Martin's a strange character too because
mhm.
he's plays real serious moments with John Wayne, but in general, he is kind of like comic relief too.
Yeah,
He's kind of like, well, no, I don't know. Like he's a little bit more to there than Mose, but he's still at various moments, particularly when dealing with Lori, out to lunch, right? He doesn't seem completely there, right?
Yeah. And so, there's these many stopping points throughout the remainder of the film that leads to, as part of the search for Debbie, that is, communicated through this letter we've already alluded to. And there's some interesting, we're going to kind of breeze through some of these stopping points. I think the Futterman, the traitor, it's
Yeah.
kind of it's like, oh wow, this is where the Hateful Eight was filmed, basically, and it's just as treacherous a bunch of people who end up trying to murder Ethan and Martin for their money. But then it goes on to they end up in, is it right away oh no, then they end up, this is actually important, because then they end up basically at the cavalry fort, right? Because
That's
it
right.
becomes winter. And what's important about this scene is because they're at this fort and they're like, well, we've got some women we've rescued, you want to see if any of them are yours. And this really, another one of the subtexts of the sexual violence, and we skipped over kind of the sexual violence that must have happened to Lori, and that led to Brad's like mania and charging and dying, is very early in the search, when it's the remaining three. It's Brad, Martin, and Ethan. Ethan does what he does. He goes off on his own. And then he comes back the next morning and he's really fucked up. We can tell he's fucked up. He's like literally stabbing at the dirt with his knife. And then it comes out that night that he had found Sarah. And Sarah, he had likely found Sarah naked because, Brad thinks he's seen Sarah, and it's because he had scouted the Comanche tribe and sees someone in a dress, and it's like, Sarah's alive, and it's like, no, that's a Comanche wearing her dress because she's dead. I buried her. And what's crazy is the film doesn't even know, like, was she dead? She might not have even, when Ethan found
Yeah.
her,
He might have been alive, right?
she might have been alive, and he just is like, he kills her potentially. We
Yeah.
don't know, and buries her in his red coat, as you've described. And this is like the true violence. So this is the true violence side of the abduction story, the violence against women, because so we know this through the story of Sarah, but then we also know this in this later story in the fort, where there are these women that are freaking out, man, in front of them, and they've truly been traumatized.
Yeah, one goes for, Martin's trying to recognize, is it you, Debbie? And
Yeah,
the
that's so.
older woman who's freaking out, it grabs the doll and is like, obviously she might have lost a baby. It was kind of very Mary Rowlandson, like
Mhm.
early American stuff, like we talked about when we talked about Not Without My Daughter, which is
Yeah.
another film we talked about, but like that captivity narrative, and how fucked up these folks were between two cultures, but also the violence. But on top of these ones who are like captives who were brought back and all of that trauma, and then the other one with two little girls. But then there's also the reality of those who were kidnapped and assimilated
Right, which
and
is
were very happy, you know
right.
what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
With their new lives, which is
yeah.
something that, the history, even in the 19th century, but certainly in the 50s, this film is probably one of the ones to really bring out,
Mhm.
even though it's not clear why Natalie Wood can change her mind so quickly from one time to the other. Initially, she's like, I don't want to go with you.
Yeah,
Like, go away. I'm married to Scar. Like,
yeah,
this
yeah,
is my new life. And that was very hard for John Wayne to hear, or for Ethan to hear. But
yeah.
like, that's an interesting point that this film kind of butts up against with these two women,
Mhm.
but doesn't fully explore as we get to the end,
No, no. And so, but in this moment, this is part of the identity of frontiersmanship, is like, it's the families and the women that bear the brunt of the violence mostly. I mean, the men do too, but the men are supposed to be the ones that are protectors, or failed protectors, or vengeance seekers, or receivers of vengeance themselves. And so, they continue on, and they finally, and this is coming towards the end, it's like they continue on, finally they end up in Mexico, and they meet this kind of kind of Mexican man who's like really a good guy and says like, yeah, I know where that Comanche tribe is. And, it'll cost you some money, but then later on he rejects it as blood money because he's an honorable man, which is kind of interesting.
It
Um,
is interesting. Yeah.
yeah. And that's a kind of respect that's ultimately kind of, I think, potentially rare as well in this era, like giving respect, presentation of,
Like the Mexican guy is like
yeah.
the most morally upright of the whole movie.
Right. Yeah. Other than the Jorgensens, basically. Yeah. And so so literally he walks them into the Comanche camp and walks Martin and Ethan into Scar's teepee. And they all sit down and and this is a really interesting moment because you're like, wait, does Scar know this is them or not? Like, you don't know, it's not
Yeah.
clear. And I really appreciate there's no exposition. It's like, be
No.
careful. He knows who you are, so we don't know as an audience and they don't know. And this is where we are greeted with, well, first Scar talks about like, I've been through it too. And this is the sympathy towards
Yeah.
the Native Americans that we've been alluding to. Scar is allowed to describe, like, I lost sons. You effectively, I know you've lost family, but I've lost family. You've taken scalps. I've taken scalps.
Yeah.
And the presenter of scalps turns out to be the assimilated Debbie, played by a very young Natalie Wood. And
Totally.
it's nuts because the
That's
scalps
right.
presented are clearly, there's a blonde one too. And we're going to later learn that that is actually Martha Edward's scalp. So it's his, and we don't know, this is someone that Ethan may or may not have had a relationship with. Those gooey eyes that we saw between them at the
Yeah.
start of the
Totally.
film. And so he immediately recognizes that's her hair.
Yeah.
Though he,
And Martin's going to make a move. Like he
yeah,
sees it and freaks out when he sees that it's Debbie.
yeah,
But Ethan plays it cool. Says, you know what? Let's go back and then we'll deal with you tomorrow. We'll talk
right,
tomorrow business. And because they came there under the pretense of trading horses,
right.
but they both know that that's not the pretense. The
No.
pretense is revenge.
And it's also, it's like Scar shows he's wearing John Wayne's war hero medal that he had in the opening scene had given to Debbie as a child. And it's like, do you see and this is like this poster. It's like, it's almost, it's not a scout per se, but it's a survivorship kind of emblem. Like, it's now his war hero medal in a weird
Yeah.
way,
Yeah. And it's also his booty from war, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And in
It's his
fact,
gold.
uh, Ethan's character got that from the Franco-Mexican War.
Right.
So like that's a medal from that war. So it's also Ethan's booty, right?
Mm,
So like there's like levels of that between
yeah.
these mercenaries and the violence on the West. And I think that's one of the great things about this film is the violence on the West in this film is completely present without
Mhm.
having to be shown. And I think that's one of the magic of some of these older films that I think recent films have lost is their ability to intone and to suggest and to
Yeah.
describe without having to kind of put you in it
Yeah.
in the way that you don't really need to see someone being scalped. You don't really need to see someone being flayed to understand that when it's
Mm.
told right well. And I like that about The Searchers. I'm kind of old school like that. Like I don't need that shit in my face. If I wanted to be a fucking surgeon, I would have been. Like I don't want to see this stuff,
This
you
is
know?
why I tell my wife I haven't watched The Pit. It's like, I hear it's a great show. I just don't need to see the close-ups of the surgery and like the
Oh,
operations. Like,
no
no,
way.
thank you.
Uh-uh.
Yeah, and so this leads to, the conflict that's very clear in Ethan because soon they've left, but it's actually interesting. Debbie follows them and says, I'm Comanche now. Go away, leave,
Yeah.
leave. And at this moment, this enrages Ethan and he tries to kill her. And it's through Martin protecting him and then the subsequent attack by the Comanche that prevents it from happening. Or we don't know for sure, like, but you get a sense like he was going to kill her because she's soiled, like she is no longer white. And that's one of the quotes from, it's like an allusion to, because the quote was direct back in the fort. And I want to get to it because it's kind of crazy because when Ethan is discussing with like the captain or commander of the fort about these women that have been assaulted and rescued, the captain says to Ethan, "It's hard to believe they're white," and his response is
Yes.
really simple and plain. It's like, "They ain't white no more,"
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
it's so harsh.
Yeah, and that's that whole race
Yeah.
question that goes throughout this. And one of the
Mhm.
interesting things about Ethan is while he says that, he speaks Comanche, he understands the Comanche
Yep.
better than anyone. He
Mhm.
is in essence, a scholar of their culture.
Yeah.
He knows they're going to come. He knows they have to come. He knows when they're coming. He can speak to them. He understands them. Like of all the people in this space who would be racist pure through ignorance or not understanding, he's different. He
Yep.
understands them so well, yet hates them so deeply.
Yeah.
And there's that interesting piece which makes him such a great character. Is
Yeah.
like he's not just this ignorant, like fly by night. He's smart, he's savvy, like he's a good fighter. He knows when to fight, when to run. He understands their language, so he's a bit of a linguist. At the same time, though, right? He's a complete racist.
Yep.
And it just makes his character so multivalent that you don't know
Yeah.
what to do with him.
Well, I think that's the Kit Carson from like my brief reading of Kit Carson history. He was exactly that. Because as a trapper, he learned Spanish. He learned multiple Native American languages. He ends up marrying a Native American, having children with them. Like that's what's so crazy. And one of the things, like, it's so funny to think, it's like, so I mean, we'll get to it, but Ethan basically doesn't kill her, and then we have this scene where they're cornered. Martin and Ethan are cornered, and this is where we have this unbelievable reading by Martin of Ethan's rewritten will, where he suddenly now recognizes Martin as his kin and he bequeaths everything to him. And he rejects Debbie as his daughter, niece, whatever it is, we don't know for sure. And because she is no longer family, she's no longer part of the tribe. She may be blood, but she's no longer part of the tribe.
Which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because now he switches his own logic where Martin wasn't part of the
Right.
tribe because he wasn't blood. He now is part of the tribe because he's shown some allegiance, I guess.
Yeah.
Whereas the lack of allegiance on Debbie's part or the defecting, right,
Yeah.
to the savages has made her completely, pariah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's interesting because nothing is stable in this
No.
movie. Everything's constantly moving depending upon Ethan's whim, if you will.
Yeah.
And it's something trippy about that whole father figure of the West and how
Uh-huh.
whimsical he is with his attitudes and his sense of morality, which is always kind of dependent upon his mood, seemingly. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
And so this is the point at which they kind of give up the search. It's over. They're like, we're done with this. She's dead to us. We leave her. And they return to this comedy of errors, ultimately, of the wedding. So Laurie's, given up on Martin and is going to be marrying. I mean, this is like literally like sitcom skit comedy, practically what happens. Laurie's going to be marrying this guy, Charlie, who's like kind of a goofball until he gets behind a guitar, and he's actually very charismatic because he's an incredible artist.
Skip to me, Lou.
Yeah.
The
And,
song.
and so, there's this big allowed fight between Martin and Charlie, and it's totally goofy. And one of the brief moments that's really interesting is Laurie's enthralled, like the classic, like, ooh, they're fighting over me, kind of moment. But, this gives way to they rediscover that the Comanche are nearby. And
Yeah.
because this film is not going to end with Natalie Wood staying with the Comanche. And
No, what a crazy ending if it did.
yeah, and so there's a final raid, and it's kind of parallel to the raid that didn't happen in the opening search, and so they do the preferred frontal assault that Ethan wanted, but they still allow Martin on his own to go in and try to sneak in and rescue Debbie
Just that
beforehand.
great scene with him dropping in, which is so
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. And so he does, and this time seeing it's just Martin, and maybe that's the implied difference maker, that Debbie suddenly gives up her assimilation instantly and Martin murders Scar and
It's a
Ethan.
hard one to manage
Yeah.
that. Like, it's almost
Yeah.
like one of those things, like the ending of this movie can't fit the complexity it's opened up for
Yeah.
us. And
Yeah.
it's like, it's almost like, Crime and Punishment. Like, the impossible world that, Dostoevsky sets up can't be answered with, I found God and everything
Yeah.
started, right? Like, so it's like this, like, you can't say, oh, okay, I'll go with you. And
Yeah.
then you get to the final scene when
Right.
she's running away, and then, uh, Ethan follows her,
Yeah.
and we get
Having just scalped Scar too. Like,
that's right. That's
yeah.
He goes full on scalping, which is
Yeah.
another crazy moment.
Yeah.
And then you see her, and there's always these scenes where they're in caves, and
Yeah.
again, they're
The
always framed in such
mhm.
interesting ways, like with the darkness. And so she runs into this cave. Ethan comes after her, and the sense is like he holds her up like he did when she was a child, and the sense is he's going to kill her, but instead he sweeps her up and let's go home.
Yeah.
And that's a scene where he really should have killed her, right?
Yeah.
Like, I
Oh,
think if we're
today.
going to keep with the searchers, like,
Yeah.
he probably should have murdered her
Right.
in the context of what this film is suggesting. Like, it's almost like one of those endings that couldn't happen, but
Right.
it was going through Ford's mind. Like, I really should probably, if I'm going to do the right thing with this movie, I should have Natalie Wood killed right here by
Yeah.
John Wayne,
Yeah.
but he couldn't, right?
No. So instead, like, he becomes the man that has to wander in Rome,
Which
because
is great. Yeah.
because of all the violence that he's witnessed and all the violence he's perpetrated. He's protected the ideal of the family. The Jorgensens are still intact. Martin is still alive. He's going to have Lori, and Debbie will reassimilate successfully. I don't know, but it doesn't, I mean, but the funny thing is, what I would rather is imagine is Ethan maybe did have like his version of a happy ending of a Kit Carson, where he does. I mean, you could easily see him finding peace with a family of a Native American wife, and having children. Like, his life would change. I mean, I don't know. I mean,
Jeremiah Johnson, like, we
yeah,
started to go
yeah,
that route,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it's a funky end, but I think this is a great place to start. I think, for this
It's a great
series.
place to start. And it's interesting too, because all of those thresholds where we talk about those frames, right? The movie starts with that frame, it ends with that frame where Ethan
Mhm.
can't come in the house, right? At the first, he's kind of brought in, but
Yeah,
at the end, it's impossible for him to kind of pass over. Is that because he's become a savage? Is that because, like, he's starting to scalp? Like, but the ultimate goal in this whole Western, if you will, is to kind of pass into those domestic spaces and
yep,
to remain there. One of the greatest spaces in this whole film, and you talked about it, was when they're doing the line dance and they're getting ready for the wedding that never happens.
right.
And you have this really warm space that you get a sense that it's out on the kind of frontier, but they're trying that civilizing notion. They're trying to civilize the space in that manifest destiny we talk about. But there's a real sense of, like, these spaces are so warm and beautifully created by him. And you get a sense, or at least I got a sense at the end of the film, that that's completely shut off from Ethan now.
He's not
He is,
allowed in it.
he's got to roam now. He's
No.
been pushed out of that, and
Mhm.
he's that person. He's that Texican who's going to continue, or that ranger, or that psycho judge from Blood Meridian, who's going to keep perpetuating the horror that makes that world possible.
Yeah.
And I think that's the relationship, is
Mhm.
one is dependent on the other, right? That violence makes that kind of warm hearth possible, whether we like it or not. And it's true even in this day. And I
Yeah.
think there's some real, I don't know, that's the undergirding for me noir element of this Searchers, right? It's a dark film in the end, and it should have ended darker. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great way to.
Don't talk over the music, Michael.
Hey, it's actually working right now. I'm not. Kind of. Yeah.
You're breaking up, man.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye bye.